Hello and welcome to the second subpool. In this one we have some other of our mid-range of submitters. I'm just going to go ahead and get this started. As mentioned before, this up first we have Floof versus Icemourn. Floof, you can see, is using a couple of the smaller shields, a bunch of the mortars, some proton swords, but they're on the exterior of the craft, which I believe leaves them pretty vulnerable. I think his fleet is homogeneous. Yeah, they're all the same ship. And then for Icemourn, we've got water Flak cannons, which, I don't know. If I had to guess, I'd say these are probably Flak cannons. But you can see he's also using a homogeneous ship. The Flak cannons, I think, are actually going to be possibly rather effective. One of the big things about the Flak cannons is that they don't really do a lot of DPS, but they do have pretty good splash radius, which allows you to punch through thinner sections of armor. And, you know, Icemourn has a pretty sizable advantage in ship count, which I feel like is actually starting to pay off, and you can see the Flak cannons digging through pretty quickly. They're not a terribly efficient weapon, but you can see the blast radius on them is rather good, which is allowing them to hit multiple segments of armor and multiple internals from without even fully punching through the ship. Unfortunately, Floof's ships, which have much longer range options, are still closing into knife fight range against the Flak cannons, which is not going terribly well for them. And yeah, Ludoshi, I will grab a link unless somebody else wants to. If you're in our Discord, there's a link in the tournament channel that actually goes to a tutorial system I've been setting up. Up next we have Floof versus Climhazzard. I started a tutorial thing where I show how to do some things like embedding modules like that, hyperstacking, how to do a bunch of little stuff. But here, Climhazzard is going with a 32 ship fleet, and each ship is pretty efficient. It's using a few lasers and barely enough thrust to make the rules. So his fleet is going to kind of creep toward the enemy and hope to get in laser range. Yeah, cleaning up general chat probably wouldn't be bad. If it's going to let you, or yeah, I guess I don't have a bot stopping you from linking. You can also, if you don't mind, Splinter, grab the playlist off of the tournaments channel. Yep. Good call, good call. Some of Climhazzard's ships are in fact carrying missiles and sitting back at a distance, as you can see, letting the laser ships provide tanking for them while they sit back and rain hell at a distance. I do highly recommend, if you're watching this video, yeah, there we go, the playlist for the other thing. I need to note that. And you can see Climhazzard took round one pretty effectively. Because your ship has a finite amount of size, it can only have a finite amount of health. And so what Climhazzard did was build very, very inexpensive ships so that he could have more of them, effectively giving him more health on the field at any given time. The caveat being that the bulk of his fleet is very close range and also very slow moving. So in theory, it should be pretty easy to kite the bulk of his fleet. But a lot of that depends on whether or not the AI decides what to do with them. And it looks like Climhazzard took round two as well. So up next we have Floof up against Jules. And what is becoming a drill style fashion. This is actually the second version of it, which means the name got considerably more ridiculous with each iteration. But here we can see lasers and proton swords, plenty of forward thrust, so this should engage pretty handily. It doesn't really have any maneuvering thrust though, so if they miss their target, then they're gonna just kind of spin around like idiots for a little while. These guys you can see are using railguns, flak, plasma, and missiles, so they'll hopefully try to keep distance a bit more effectively. Torpedoes and plasmas on that. So what else we got here? Mortars, autocannons. So you can see drills is bringing just a little bit of everything, for the most part. You got some rockets and mortars in here. Just generally going apeshit, trying to use a lot of the weapons that the Terrans have. Many of which are rather good. The Terrans have some of the more diverse weapon selections. And you can see right off the bat though, the splash radius from all the mortars and things like that Floof is bringing, causing havoc and taking out one of Drill's ships immediately. But because Drills has 15 ships, taking one of them out isn't a very big deal. Meanwhile, you can see a couple of Floof's ships are getting worn down and are getting very low on health. When isolated, Floof's ships are dispatching Drill's ships pretty effectively, but a lot of that boils down to just simply budget. If Drills has 15 ships that each cost about 1,000 and Floof's each cost about 4,000, then the 4,000 point ship should obviously have an advantage, while the cheaper ship should lose that engagement, theoretically. But trading a 4,000 point ship for a 1,000 point ship isn't very productive use of your time, because while Floof's ships were isolating and killing targets one at a time, the rest of Drill's fleet surrounded and swarmed what Floof had. And here again we see kind of the same thing where Drill's ships are trying to swarm and surround Floof's. Now, swarming and surrounding the way that Drill's ships have been doing is actually doubly productive. In addition to attacking your opponent and taking off all of their whatever fringe stuff they might have, by having your ships close range and in the way, the enemy can't escape either. Which, if you've been paying much attention to tournaments, you'll see every once in a while a ship will escape with almost nothing, run across the field, rebuild itself, and come back. What is it? So being able to block the enemy and prevent them from escaping is actually very, very useful. Although you can't really plan for it, you can just kind of encourage it and allow the environment to make it happen from time to time. We have very few controls over the AI, so we can only do so much. But Drills takes round 2. And up next we have Icemourn up against Climhazzard. And here we saw Icemourn's fleet do rather well. They were able to punch through even with the relatively inefficient Flak cannons because they were able to hit and deal damage to multiple segments at a time. They generally did pretty well, but I feel like they're going to lack the damage output to really get through all of the health that Climhazzard is able to field. Alright, so Climhazzard, the way that I set the pools, the way I set up the pools, is the first pool, I first grab whoever has only submitted once or twice to an NMSS tournament, which is why I call it the Neophyte pool. And so they get immediately shoved into the first pool. Then I go to... and then everything else is in the order that they were submitted. So if you were here for the first pool, it was Laps, Ludoshi, and Brizzlebra, which is the order I received their fleets, but because each of them were only submitting for the first time, they all got shoved up to the first pool. Then it was the first 2 submissions that I had received from people who had been in tournaments before. So even if you were only 6 hours in, I think you were the 6th or 7th fleet I received. Some of the ships popped up almost in... I feel like some of these fleets were submitted within an hour of announcing the rules. Although those ones have already gone, obviously. And Climhazzard takes round 1. And I suspect round 2 is going to go roughly similar. Like I said, I think Climhazzard just has too much HP on the field, and it's going to be a problem for Icemourn's fleet to just punch through all of that health. He is doing quite a bit of damage though, but a lot of that just has to do with the fact that Climhazzard's fleet brought a lot of health, but it didn't bring as much damage as some of the other fleets we're seeing. So matches against Climhazzard, your fleet will probably last longer, but Climhazzard is planning on his staying power to do the work for him. And in the meantime, the Terran lasers are actually pretty good weapons. They're extremely cost efficient, even if their range and damage isn't that high. They also have a lot of mass, which can be a problem on any ship that needs to kite, but they do reliable damage because they can't miss, really. And Climhazzard takes round 2. So up next we have Icemourn up against Drills. Icemourn's been doing pretty well so far. Drills has a pretty big numerical advantage, and he's also got the mortars, which you can see the mortars hitting the nose of the ship still took out internals from halfway down the large segment in the front. There's and yeah, you can see a shot from the side. I think it may have actually killed the ship entirely. I don't know if it hit a reactor or something near the core, but the mortars get one of the largest splash radius in the game. They, at least when they're fully charged, but their splash radius depends on how much they charge. And you can't really tell the AI to fully charge before firing the weapon, unfortunately. If you could, then the mortars would be one of the better weapons in the game, I think. But as it is, the damage and the radius scale with charge time, which essentially makes their power exponentially greater the longer they charge, up to their maximum. Yeah, and as Splinter mentioned, with mortars, you can actually use spinners to get the AI to use them correctly. If the spinner is large enough that it can't fire at the target from one end of the spinner to the other, then it will charge in the back. So if you design your spinner correctly and make it so that it takes a decent amount of a charge to rotate the craft, you can actually get them to charge up and use the mortars more correctly. But you're getting into a whole slew of overcomplication. Although at the same time, you know, if that's the kind of problem you enjoy solving, that's a very good approach, and I highly recommend trying it out and maybe seeing if there's a more effective method. I think one of the things, we've got Flypaste here in chat, one of the things he likes to do is build his ships with mortars so that they'll rush in, fire the mortars, and then disengage, and then come back, which is one of the neat things. And yeah, Dalek, I think you were in the first pool. Yeah, Dalek, you were in the first pool. And Jules takes the match. So now we have Climhazzard up against drills, which actually I think both of these won 2 rounds already, so they might both be shoo-ins for the final pool, or the champion pool. Yeah, these matches have been really short, which I kind of like, but I feel like a lot of the reason it's really short is because everyone is forced to use a very odd sort of configuration. But at the very least, we have no giant blocks of armor to just run down the clock, basically. Which is kind of nice, but at the same time, I don't terribly like limiting player creativity. Yeah, there's been very little or no stacking so far. He said, almost as though he knew that that was going to change. And these two fleets are actually matching up pretty well against each other. If you look at the scoreboard, they're like 100 points apart, which is very close. And their ship counts are pretty different, but ultimately both fleets are using more ships than we've usually been seeing out of submissions so far. Which I think has a lot to do with why the points are so close. But both fleets also appear very adept at this sort of close distance and brawl. The mortars from drills giving him initial advantages, but I think after the initial blast, because his ships aren't disengaging, the efficacy of the mortars is dramatically reduced. You really want those fully charged mortar blasts. But that said, the point gap is swinging in the other direction for pretty strongly in favor of Kamikaze Dalek. Drills is just slowly starting to run out of ships, and that's giving, or rather not Kamikaze Dalek, but Climhazzard takes round 1. That's where I was going with it. But you can see Drills was doing very well, I think, until he started to run out of ships. They trade ships very effectively, but once Climhazzard starts to get the ship count advantage, then the fight can really only go one way. Oh, and the design? So basically, originally in the tournament, I wasn't going to allow any sort of stacking at all. So I wanted to create pockets big enough to allow a reasonable variety of weapons. I wasn't going to allow the placement of any armor modules or any stacking or anything like that. So I wanted to have big enough holes in the ship to place whatever weapons you really want. That's where sort of the long, I'm going to call them the antimatter cutouts, because that's really the template I used to make sure they were big enough, is whether or not that was a big enough area to fit an antimatter. The 3x3 squares around the rest of the ship, I intended for you to be able to use to place weapons or shields or whatever you wanted in there. I was also originally not going to allow anything on the exterior of the ship except thrusters, but I changed my mind on that because it felt too restrictive. After designing sort of the original ship didn't have these two, like these little pillbox areas here on the side. The original design didn't have those either. It was just a slope up the front of the ship, and so I wanted more space, so I created those little pillbox things. And after all of that was done, the ship just looked too plain, so I threw some fucking spikes on it. Just to give you extra surfaces to play with, should you feel so inclined, and help mitigate some of the splash vulnerability while also leaving some at the same time. I don't know, I just I threw together the bulk of the chassis one day, decided I didn't like it, saved it, came back the next day and decided to improve it. And it wasn't really a whole lot of thought process in it behind that. And Climhazzard takes the match.